Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Rajkumari Niyogi, and with me I have Sarah Payton. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, Rajkumari, and hello, everyone.
So today we're going to continue the conversation, and we're going to start with transforming the self-critical voice. Now, I know that many of us have had this experience of being critical to the self, and sometimes we use the word harsh critic to kind of label it. I'm going to hand off the ball to you, Sarah, and have you start us off talking about the brain and where that shows up in the hemispheres.
Oh, thank you, Rajkumari. So, if you'll remember from our first presentation, or perhaps if you've heard me speak before about the left and the right hemispheres, you'll remember that we do have two hemispheres. We have one that's on the left side and one that's on the right side, and that they have a different way that they're arranged, that the neurons, the actual neurons, are different in the left and the right hemispheres, that there's an order and structure, sort of like graph paper, in the left hemisphere, and there's a wildness, like Amazonian jungle vines running everywhere in the right hemisphere. So if we come back to the left hemisphere for a moment, the left hemisphere is like graph paper. It's also maybe like an orchard of trees where there are rows and kind of columns. This sense of differentiation and the neurons not connecting widely across the hemisphere. And so if one tree in one corner of an orchard wants to get information to a tree in another corner of the orchard, it has to travel from tree to tree. If a squirrel were moving through that orchard, it would have to jump from tree to tree to tree to tree in order to reach the far corner of the orchard. So the left hemisphere, in order to be able to function, really functions in an atmosphere of orderliness and structure. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, if that squirrel were traveling in the right hemisphere, it could stay on one neuron for a very long time and reach quite a lot of the brain. So the right hemisphere, throughout the animal kingdom, actually weighs more than the left hemisphere. We've said that before. But what's important about understanding the structure of the left hemisphere is that because of its reliance on segmented bits of information, it is a place that measures and analyzes and looks to see how far short of our own personal plan and expectations we are falling. It is a place that really loves balance and precision, and if we're talking about social grace, the left hemisphere wants perfectionism. It wants us to be perfect at all times, to hit the right social note, to say the right thing, to fit in the right way, to follow through with everything we've ever said we would do. It's got very high standards. It has very high standards for us and very high standards for others. If we're turning that lens outward and looking at the outer world, then people are falling short of our desires for the human race. If we're turning that lens inward, then we are never enough.
Wow, it's very, very intense.
Yes.
How does the right hemisphere react to the moment when we are having the experience of I am never enough or they are never enough, or a variation of that?
The right hemisphere reacts, how does it react? What it does is, if we don't have a right prefrontal cortex that can kind of catch this sense of not being enough, then we can move into depression. We can move into rage. We can move into hopelessness. We can move into a constant state of anxiety. So the right hemisphere, if you'll remember, is the one that's connected to the body. So the experience of being in the world is one of being this very finely tuned registering instrument that's bringing all kinds of information about what it's like to be Rajkumari in the world, what it's like to be Sarah in the world, into our being. And then it's kind of moving up to our brain to be interpreted and decoded. Those of us who live, as the famous literary quote says, 10 feet from our body, are less likely to receive these messages of disquiet, or worry, or warmth, or fear, or really knowing ourselves and knowing what we want. So that the part of what is happening when we're working with a self-critical voice, especially a savage self-critical voice, is that the right prefrontal cortex, the part of our own brain that is capable of wisdom and self-compassion, is offline. So if we can bring that wisdom and self-compassion online, and we'll talk about how to do that today, then we really have something different that it starts to happen.
So the question that is coming to the front here for me is, how does the right hemisphere even know how to go offline?
The right prefrontal cortex is an area that is built, grown, reinforced, supported, and nourished by relationship. This nourishment of our right hemisphere begins when we're in the womb and continues almost unabated by any left hemisphere development or contribution until we're 18 months to 2 years old. So our relational brain really starts to be formed in response to the presence or lack of presence of others. The more that we are held with warmth and compassion in our life, the more awakened our right hemisphere is, our right prefrontal cortex is, and the more ease we have at every moment in our life.
This is so interesting. I have a bazillion questions. I'm trying to create a visual and then relate it back to examples in the workplace.
Sure.
So what I'm hearing you say in essence is, however these standards are developed within ourselves, however we determine how these standards are set forth, and that we use these rules or guidebooks as how to kind of allow us to navigate in the world and show up in the world. And I didn't do this correctly, or I did this correctly, or I feel really good right now. These are in essence judgments, right? And these judgments allow us to have some palpable sense of boundaries. Is that right?
The judgments tend to be they're interestingly enough, it's less about boundary and more about meaning making. The left hemisphere, left to its own devices, is very bewildered about trying to integrate new information unless it can blame someone. One of my favorite NVC practitioners, Dominic Barter, says that conflict is new information entering a system.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah. So in the experience of new information entering the brain, if the right prefrontal cortex is not available to do the big picture integration, really put this into the big picture of our lives and our deeper understanding, then the left hemisphere looks for somebody to blame in order to make sense of the new information.
So this is where it's absolutely critical in conflict to have an emotional repair.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Because if that doesn't happen, then this information that's coming in can only be processed through blame.
Yes.
Until the right hemisphere now has a place of feeling, I don't know if this is the right word, but safe or welcomed to participate in this process,
yes.
Then the person now is able to literally vacillate away from the single story left hemisphere into the whole picture right hemisphere and begin to attach to themselves
Yes.
and notice what's going on with them, and then actually kind of calm down, maybe move into the parasympathetic state, and then start to have curiosity about why this person may have the behavior, that they just had.
Yes. Yes.
And so without the repair, this is the disastrous cycle in the left hemisphere, which is, and this is the journey into severe and prolonged trauma? It seems like this would be.
Well, certainly it doesn't provide any help at all in terms of making our lives more wonderful. For example, in a workplace, if you think about workplaces, which I've been thinking about the whole brain workplace as a new goal for all of us. But the left hemisphere workplace, here's a problem that's arising. A report is not turned in on time. Instead of looking systemically, the left hemisphere workplace looks for who to blame.
Right.
So then there's a kind of an overlapping layeredness of the effort to find where this responsibility, at whose door this responsibility can be laid for the problem. So we end up, with people being penalized for their bonuses and losing their co-workers' respect and in the most extreme instances, of course, being fired.
Right. And so I just wrote about this yesterday, as a matter of fact, about what happens when there's, in a meeting, for example, you're dreading to going to a meeting. You're dreading a meeting because the person that is part of this team or in this meeting has affronted you in some way in the past, and there was never any repair. So now it has become the situation at the workplace for you that you're putting up with them.
Yes.
And so every single time you see this person, the brain has now coded them as pain or whatever, and it becomes challenging and painful, literally and metaphorically, to deal with them.
Yes.
And that is because, for whatever reason, the workplace hasn't yet invited safety of doing emotional repair.
That's correct.
And so how we implement emotional repair can be something so simple as, hey, I noticed that this happened. Can I get some clarity, right? There's very clear, simple techniques that you can use in communication to really surface and repair that disconnect.
Yes.
And so we have to become a little more vigilant and a little more masterful in having these smaller, less charged conversations more quickly and more easily, rather than moving into one-on-ones where we're having these, crucial conversations where people are really terrified about how am I going to say, what am I going to do? But really just kind of being in the hall, by the water cooler, getting coffee. Can I talk to you for just a few minutes? This happened. What was your intent? I understood it to be this. Grateful to hear that it wasn't. Awesome. And then that's the first piece. And then the second piece is then coming back to self. And this is the transforming of the self-critical voice, coming back to self and now stepping into a place of self-repair, right? So now there was the external repair with the other person, and now there needs to be the self-repair. And very similarly, what you shared earlier today, you went on a business trip earlier this month, and you were having some experiences. In the moment that you checked in with yourself, that shifted for you, showing up differently and more comfortably, or
yes.
whatever the words are for you.
Yes, and not just checking in with myself, but really using the tools that we're teaching in this workshop, the tools of self-empathy, the tools of self-connection, really bringing a sense of warmth and resonance and understanding to ourself, both in this present moment and historically, in relationship with any pieces that are being touched of implicit memory, of non-conscious memory that are starting to surface. Just a real gentleness and warmth with ourselves. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I want to just kind of say that for me, checking in means exactly what you just said. that is checking in and self-soothing in that way, and using the communication of self-empathy and self-compassion. And so I remember you saying, if we can just for a moment take a breath and stand in that observer place just for a moment, then it gives us enough spaciousness to look at the possibility of even considering self-soothing, self-empathy, self-compassion.
Yeah. And it occurs to me that in the workplace, that's such an interesting invitation, because in the workplace, we're so often we kind of put a limitation around our edges. Like, this is my work self. This is Sarah's work self. And Sarah's work self should not be affected by Sarah's personal life. So part of the right hemisphere vision, part of this big vision, is actually allowing those links to be explicit within ourselves. That yes, Sarah is at the workplace, and yesterday night there was a terrible fight in the home, and things were thrown, and voices were raised, and hearts are hurting, and there is an impact. There is an effect that Sarah is carrying in the workplace today, not as an excuse, but as a reason for self-compassion, as
validation,
as a groundedness for understanding the ebbs and flows of our own productivity and effectiveness. Yeah.
And to really also underscore that, as I do the work with my clients, and as I run them through the coaching framework, what I have really come to find is that so many others, these patterns that have stabilized in our lives just play out over and over and over again in our workplace. And we're not even aware that that's happening.
That's so true.
And I just was working with a client who decided to take a break for personal reasons. Something pretty traumatic just happened, and this person, basically the abandonment of his father at 2 was never really addressed in his life. And though he did do some quote-unquote therapy, ultimately it was, that's over with, I'm moving on. Right? Yeah. In our discussions, what he found is that he's only had a job for 2 years his entire life.
Interesting.
And that this, one of the things that he also said was, before his mother remarried, he, as a young child, and her were a team. And the moment that the new family came in, he withdrew. Mm. And he has had this experience throughout the workplace of teams pushing him out, or him withdrawing from teams over a course of time. Now, this might seem coincidental, it might seem insignificant, but the truth is, from my experience, these patterns are absolutely highlighting what is still running within the self system, right, within you.
Yeah.
And until that pattern is interrupted with awareness and then with some compassion and empathy reweaving techniques in the brain, can this person then integrate and complete the pattern and move on?
Yes. Certainly, this question, I think, takes us back to my continuing gold standard question. My question is always, how is the body doing? So, for example, if this person were to see this and feel relief, if they're like, oh, this is an interesting thing to see. I understand this. I'm not going to work anymore on it, but I see it. And their body relaxed completely. And then they found themselves experiencing well-being and seeing a shift in the patterns, then they would have done enough. It's like there's no recipe for human healing. What is most important is, what does the body do? What does our body say? And are we experiencing relief from our patterns?
That's one of the things I have on my website. Accountability breeds relief.
Yeah.
Right. So I love that you said there's no recipe for healing, because I agree with that fully. For me, every healing modality is simply permission to make a different choice. And it's just about giving yourself permission to choose differently and show up differently.
And certainly, certainly, if we discover a pattern like this, it is incredibly effective to begin to create a bond of empathy with the part of ourselves, with that little 2-year-old one, with the one who lost the sense of teamwork, to be able to go, oh, was this a shock? Do you need acknowledgement? The bottom just fell out of your world.
Right.
Yeah. So here's something else that's important to know about our self-critical voice, that it can be on automatic. It is a part of we can see this in the brain, that it's a part of what Matthew Lieberman calls the default network. That when we've experienced trauma, and when our right hemisphere, the right prefrontal cortex, is not online in a way that holds us with gentleness and warmth and resonance, then we can have this automatic, recurring kind of cutting ourselves with the razors of our thoughts it'll just go on and on and on. This is what I call the savage default network, and part of research shows that one thing that's effective in transforming the default network is to start a mindfulness practice, particularly a mindfulness practice where we're bringing warmth to the self. So that can be that very easy, just that 3-breath practice of finding the alive place in your breathing, allowing your attention to rest on that alive place in your breathing, and if your attention stays there, then surrounding your attention with warmth. If your attention wanders, addressing your attention with warmth. Hey, attention, thank you for bringing my attention to something that you believe is important or rewarding. Would you be willing to come back to my breath for just a moment here, just for another 2 counts? So just that gentleness with the self that we can begin to practice in such a grounded and straightforward way is something that begins to change the brain and helps to detoxify that automatic savage default network where we're always finding a fault with ourselves. Another way to work with this savage default network is to begin to awaken the insula. The insula is the part of the brain, especially in the right hemisphere, the right insula, that gives us the link between our body sensations and our emotions. So as we begin to track those body sensations, name them, and ask ourselves the gentle question, if this body sensation were an emotion, what would it be? And as we begin to ask that question and say, oh, if that were fear, what is it that I would really be longing for? If I were actually afraid, what would I be longing for? And to maybe take a couple of stabs at guessing. Maybe I'm longing for a world where people treat each other with gentleness. Maybe I'm longing for the clarity and the total insight that I can sometimes have. So as we begin to make these guesses for ourselves, there's a real warmth and resonance and gentleness that begins to enter our daily, moment by moment, thought by thought practice of living. And as we bring that in, we transform those automatic networks. So Rajkumari, thank you. I just wanted to bring those two solid skill-based, offerings of practices we can integrate to the table here in transforming our self-critical voice.
That's beautiful, Sarah. Thank you so much for sharing that and for adding that to the conversation. So this is a perfect segue now, I think, to talk about the importance of mentorship as we begin to build this practice of mindfulness and this looking towards self and reattaching to self and beginning to speak gently and exploring and discovering what it is that we're longing for and why we're having the feelings that we're having in this moment, whether it's from the present moment or, as you said, from historical evidence. how do we bring forward this mentorship, the importance of mentorship in the workplace? How do we bring that forward and weave it into this conversation of self and into the conversation of others?
Join us for our next session to discover the answers to these questions. Thank you very much, everyone, for being with us today.